They might not have adamantium claws or the ability to control the weather with their mind, but genetic superheroes may walk among us. These are people who should have serious genetic diseases according to mutations in their DNA, but they don't, and we don't know why. With more research, scientists working on the Resilience Project are hoping to discover new biological factors that protect humans from disease, or even new treatments for people who are living with these life-threatening conditions. In a study published last week in Nature Biotechnology, the researchers analyzed small sections of nearly 600,000 human genomes, or personal DNA sequences. All of these data came from people who chose to use DNA testing companies and anonymously donated their information to science. After a careful screening process, the scientists found 13 adults with mutations known to cause 8 different debilitating and sometimes lethal childhood diseases. And here's the catch: they all had healthy medical records. One of those diseases was cystic fibrosis, where a mutated gene causes excess mucus production in the lungs and other organs. This can make it really hard to breathe or absorb any nutrients, plus lots of other painful symptoms. Other more rare conditions cause defects in skull and facial development or severe autoimmune problems, and some are almost always lethal in childhood. And also, there must be things that scientists don't quite understand about these diseases. Ideally, we'd like to learn more from the full genomes and other biological samples of these so-called genetic superheroes, but unfortunately, nobody knows who they are, since all the DNA data were anonymous. And the consent forms that these 13 people signed don't give the researchers permission to recontact them. So, in a way, their secret identities are intact, and they may never know how special they are. This does also make these findings somewhat speculative, though. After all, without actually meeting these people to collect more data, the researchers can't double-check their results or prove that there weren't errors in the health records or DNA tests. However, the Resilience Project hopes to recruit more people who are happy to be recontacted if they turn out to be genetic superheroes. You may even be one yourself. But let's move on from our genes to our brains. Last week, research groups based in the UK broke through decades of scientific silence and published 2 separate sets of findings that, for the first time, used modern brain imaging to scan people tripping on LSD. LSD, or acid, is one of the best-known psychedelic drugs. A dose of LSD can cause visual hallucinations, as well as a sensation known as ego-dissolution, where the sense of self slips away, leaving a feeling that's been described as oneness with the universe. LSD was widely studied in the 1950s and 60s before it was banned pretty much everywhere. But these days, it's hard to find funding for any experiment involving illegal drugs, even carefully designed experiments that get specifically licensed by multiple ethics committees and could help us learn new things about our brains. And no funding usually means no science. The trouble is, the field of neuroscience has advanced a lot in the past 50 years, which means there's a huge gap in our knowledge about the possible harms or even therapeutic benefits of drugs like LSD. For the studies released last week, the authors got around these problems by getting all the proper legal permissions, plus partly crowdfunding their research through Wallacea, which is like Kickstarter for science. For the experiments, they recruited 20 people with prior experience using psychedelics, hooked them up to a bunch of brain tracking machines, and injected around 1 recreational dose, 75 micrograms of LSD. Then, the participants recorded their experiences as best they could. The researchers compared these descriptions to the brain scans to try and piece together the inner workings of tripping out brains. Mostly, the hallucinations seemed to affect activity in the subject's visual cortex, an area that normally deals with vision. After a dose of LSD, the visual cortex received more blood flow and started communicating more with regions nearby. There was also a drop in strength of the alpha brainwaves, which could be connected to a drop in inhibition. Basically, the brain was freewheeling, generating vivid images even when people shut their eyes. And then there were more widespread changes. They found that LSD increased interactions between brain regions that often don't talk to each other, while the brain's busiest communication superhighways got quieter. One of the researchers described the effect as being kind of like a unified, more integrated brain, rather than the usual more distinct sections, and a unified brain was strongly linked to a feeling of ego-dissolution. Overall, the scientists who carried out the studies believe more research about LSD's effects on the mind reveal more about consciousness itself. They also hope that the success of these trials will encourage more carefully conducted research into other illegal drugs so we can understand them better. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow News, which was brought to you by our president of space, Tariq. If you want to be president of space and help support the show, just go to patreon.com/scishow, and if you just want to keep getting smarter with us, you can go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe. Yes. They infected 6 of these organoids with Zika and left 6 uninfected. When they measured the organoids after 11 days, the infected ones were only about 60% as big.